we're going to take some time to grieve. Maybe to cry. Maybe even to shed some tears, because all of our readings today talk about tears. And very often, I think in our culture today, we try to move away from our grief, to move ahead too fast. That very often we want to celebrate life when someone has died, but sometimes then we fail to grieve. We fail to truly acknowledge the difference in our lives as a result of death. So today, we're going to take some time to grieve. On Friday night, I was at Bethel Synagogue here in Alexandria. Synagogues across the country invited Jews and non-Jews alike to come to Shabbat on Friday and Saturday of this past week to recognize and acknowledge the violent act of anti-Semitism that resulted in 11 deaths last Saturday. The deaths at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And so as we were gathering at Bethel, one of the things that I did afterwards is I did some reading about Jewish rituals around the time of death. Because I knew that there are a lot of rituals I didn't really know a lot about. And I think it's helpful for us as we consider what our rituals at the time of death are to think about what other people's do at time of death. So at the very first time that someone hears of the news of a loved one's death, they are to share a blessing. They pray a prayer of blessing upon the news of a loved one's death immediately. And then afterwards, what they often will do is that the body will be immediately prepared, and the funeral often happens right away. But also, the close loved ones will often take a scissors and cut a tear in their clothing. And what that symbolizes is that as a result of this death, there is the hole in the fabric of our normal life. There is something gone that will not be replaced. There is a tear in our lives. After a funeral, there is a 7 days, which is called Shiva. Some of you may know the phrase of sitting Shiva. And what that means is that mourners gather in the home of the one who has lost a loved one. The door is left open. So mourners come and they just come into the house and they sit. And the tradition is that those who are coming to visit don't say a word. They wait. And if the one who is grieving speaks, then they speak back. But the one who is grieving can ignore those visitors, because this is a time for them to grieve. Just sit with the grief and with those who have come to pay their respects. That lasts for 7 days. And then there is a period of time for 12 months, for a full year after a loved one has died, in which the mourner's prayer, the Kaddish, is said. Those who have lost loved ones pray that same prayer every single day for a year. But this is what happens at synagogue. And this is what I witnessed on Friday night. That at the end of the Sabbath service, there is a time right before the whole community prays the Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, where names are read. First, they read the names of those who have died in the past year. Then they read the names of those who are celebrating the anniversary of a loved one's death. And then they invite others who are in the community to stand if they have had a death in the past 12 months. It's a powerful witness to acknowledging grief, to acknowledging loss, to not just move ahead and start a new life and pretend that our clothes have not been torn, that there is a hole in the fabric of our normal life. So we come to today's gospel reading, the story of Jesus with his best friend, Lazarus. Now, at the time of this story takes place, Jesus and his disciples are a couple miles away from the town of Bethany. Bethany is where Lazarus lived with his two sisters, Martha and Mary. And Jesus is far away with his disciples when he hears the news that Lazarus has died. And an interesting piece of scripture, what happens is Jesus stays where he is for a couple of days, but then he makes his way back. And here is, and what we heard today, is this encounter then with one of Lazarus' sisters. She comes out to Jesus, and it seems like she's angry. She says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And then we have a gift from Jesus. Because Jesus at that moment is deeply moved. Our translation says that he is deeply moved and disturbed. The Greek word means his insides are affected. He has a visceral grief reaction. And then we hear that Jesus begins to weep. He begins to shed tears. Now, perhaps for those of us who are followers of Jesus, those of us who are Christians, we may wonder, why in the world would Jesus cry? Didn't he know what he was going to do? Didn't he realize that Lazarus was going to be alive again? Why would Jesus cry? I think it's a good thing to think about. Debbie Thomas is an author that I read recently, and she said she came up with 4 reasons that Jesus might have cried at the time of Lazarus' death. The first reason, she said, is because Jesus cried because it legitimizes all of human grief, our grief as well. Sure, Jesus knew that Lazarus was and would always be with God, but our joy, our understanding that loved ones who have died are with God and at peace, doesn't cancel out our grief. There is still grief, despite the joy. Jesus' example of crying at the time of death helps us to know that it's okay for us to cry too. A second reason that Debbie Thomas said that Jesus cried is because he knew that things were never going to be the same. Anybody who has been in a family when there has been great loss knows that we are changed by that loss. That there is our whole bunch of events around that person, through our friends and through our community, that are forever changed. Now, Lazarus came back to life, but that didn't mean everything was going back to be the same. Lazarus was changed. He was a man who was dead and now was alive. Who knows how the community accepted him after that time? Perhaps he was seen as a hero, but perhaps he was a pariah. Death changes us, and maybe that's why Jesus cried. A third reason that Jesus may have cried is because he was recognizing his own mortality at that moment. He knew what he was going to do. He knew that Lazarus would be raised from the dead, and yet that very event of raising Lazarus from the dead was the precipitating event in the Gospel of John that led to Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. Jewish leaders saw Jesus as a particularly dangerous man at that point, someone who could raise the dead. So perhaps Jesus knew that there was no going back at this point. He was acknowledging his own mortality and that he would die as well. So perhaps that's why Jesus was greatly moved and disturbed. And the fourth reason that Debbie Thomas speaks about why Jesus might have cried is because he knew, perhaps, that sorrow changes us. That sorrow can transform us. That sorrow can bring justice in the midst of healing. One of the prime ministers of Great Britain by the name of William Gladstone, who I remember reading about years ago, but I don't remember exactly who he was. But this is what he said about death and nations who deal with the dead. He said, "Show me the manner in which a nation cares for its dead, and I will measure with mathematical exactness the tender mercies of its people. How we care for our dead reflects in how we care for those who are living. Sorrow can lead to justice. Sorrow can lead to transformation. Sorrow can change us. So today, I'd like us to take some time to grieve. Today, I'm going to share those who have died recently in our nation, in our world, and in this very community. And I invite you to take a moment of prayerful reflection as I share their names. Today, we remember 4 members of the Good Shepherd community: Stafford, Pearl, Marlon, and Pat. Today, we remember 4 women from Guest House who died this past year: Maria, Carrie, Emma, and Sally. Today, we remember Matthew Shepard, whose remains were interred at the Washington National Cathedral last week. Today, we remember Vicki and Maurice, who were killed at the Kroger in Kentucky as a result of racism. Today, we remember the 11 worshipers at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh: Joyce, Richard, Rose, Jerry, Cecil, David, Bernice, Sylvan, Daniel, Melvin, and Irving. Today, we remember the 29 people who were killed as a result of transgender violence last year in the United States. Today, we remember the 45 people who died on the streets in Washington, D.C. last year. Today, we remember the 115 people who died yesterday as a result of the opioid crisis. Take time to grieve. The way a nation cares for its dead reflects how we care for its living. Take the time. Amen.